ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to try and talk to this at a distance, even though I can't see it terribly well, so I'm going to play it by ear. My name's Ross Naidoo. I'm the Food Science Liaison for the Department of Ag and Fisheries. Between 2019 and 21, I carried out an industry analysis of the Queensland hemp industry, and these are some of the findings that I am presenting today, summary of findings. Next slide, please. The approach that I used was using Michael Porter's 5 forces, which I think some would be acquainted with. I'm not entirely sure if you're acquainted with Michael's 5 forces, but it's generally used to do industry analysis globally. It also looks at clusters and hubs as well. Its measurements are done in low, medium, and high intensity, and in between we can establish the competitiveness of the industry as we move along. Essentially, it's the barriers to entry, the barriers to exit, supplier power, and buyer power, which is involved in trying to describe the industry. Next slide, please. And I'm going to try and look at this, and it's very difficult for me to see this, but basically what we're saying here is that the barrier power is, and I'm going to talk through my own slide. Well, hopefully you can hear me. I'm just turning on my slide on my computer so I can see where I am, so I can talk through it. Just bear with me a moment whilst I do this. And as I say, next slide, I'll just proceed with that. Okay, so in terms of barriers to entry, the industry is considered to be a high barrier entry industry. And some of this will be intuitive and well known. Comparative regulatory environment is high. Production practices, material intensity, knowledge of that is high. So you have to gain that access to that information before you can proceed. Equipment and the cost of money for setting up the establishment of cropping and value adding is high. Access to distribution channels is not developed, which results in a high barrier. High levels of proprietary knowledge, which means that to be able to access that knowledge, you need to know where to get it and how to access it, to use it. Access to favourable locations, new materials, know-how is considered low because most of the land is already used for cropping systems. There's a fairly high learning curve involved in growing industrial cannabis and further processing and harvesting, etc. And the presence of government subsidies range from low to high depending which state you are. Next slide, please. And I'm going through my slides on my computer, assuming you know that we're on to the next slide. The next slide is called the supplier power, and once more, this is considered to be a high area in terms of suppliers have a high power over the industry. When you look at the top ASX listed companies in this area, in this sector, there's a roughly $1.7 billion, and the top concentration ratio, that is the top 4 firms, control over $900 million of the invested intensity, which means that they've got high controls over the industry per se, or should have high controls over the industry. There's also high concentration of supplier power and plant breeding rights, so the seed ownership, which means that that's another entry barrier when you're trying to access the seeds and use them with some degree of freedom. There's a great high reliance on inputs from non-Australian sources. There's limited value-adding facilities, limited supply chain cohesion, and supply chains and value-addeds are usually concentrated in the larger actors in the sector. And the R&D proprietary is based in limited controlled companies. So in other words, to access any of that proprietary knowledge, it's locked away. Next slide, please. Buyer intensity, once more, this is considered high as well because the buyers have a fair degree of control. Buyer concentrated in plant breeding rights and seed supplier rights. Final consumption is dominated by seed providers' buyback contract models. Difficult to establish backwards or forward integration due to plant breeding rights and buyback business models. Back in 2019, the price sensitivity around imported seeds was around $1.80 a kilo, and buyback of seeds domestically was at 2.85. Large companies control most seed supply in the order of tens of tons per annum, and small to medium suppliers were in the order of tens to hundreds of kilos of seed per annum when I was doing my primary and secondary survey. This is an area which is really the strength of the industry. Substitutes for hemp are low in terms of low production. The closest generic crops were canola, cotton, and canaf, as was suggested in the primary survey. The above crops are empirically known and retain well-established market and supply chains, so it means if hemp was going to try and move into the supply chains via these already established supply chains might be the way to go. Canola and cotton supply 90% of oil seed production in Australia, so there's a low to medium substitute effect there, but it also means that oil might be able to conjure it through those supply chains. There are no real substitutes for industrial hemp provision in the food, fibre, health and carbon sequestration space. And the ability to potentially provide all required amino acids for human nutrition is difficult to replicate. So this is actually a real strength for hemp. So their substitutes for hemp are actually quite low. If we're looking at the competitiveness, and that's the rivalry intensity when we put this all together, you can say it's low for a number of reasons. Whole crop use is low. Regulation and legislation for whole crop use is relatively high. Access to suitable seeds and agronomic information is difficult. Closed-loop business model means compels the sale of seeds back to suppliers. Inexperience with cropping and value chains, lack of scale production of cropping, harvest, seed, fibre and health products, lack of supply chain connectivity and sophistication, education, low, attraction of investment funds is reasonably low, and information transparency is low. Strategic support from government is considered low, and the relative crop yields versus growing conditions was low depending on when you took your samples. So when we look at this analysis, you then start to say, well, what can we do about these areas which are considered to be high barriers of entry? So some of the suggestions would be, for Queensland, for example, would be, or Australia in general, would be create a centralised transport web presence for industry relevant information, including regulations. And that could be done by any of the associations, even the Hemp CRC if they so wished, undertaking R&D to support cropping and supply chain support, especially with tropical varieties, because this is the Queensland focus, and the value improvement of seeds and fibre at an upstream industry level, value adding to access new markets as a downstream industry level, developing a North Queensland cluster of supply chain firms from growing to value adding to export at an industry level. When we look at substitutes, maybe a great education in the industry of what substitutes are out there and really are they substitutes. Once more, develop a cluster in North Queensland because the focus of my study was about Queensland, and look at an industry level of development and supply chain development and exports. And look at supply chain logistics coordination undertaken from a midstream industry level. By that I mean distribution centres are generally midstream between upstream and downstream value adding. So to adopt a perspective from that positioning would possibly be worthwhile undertaking. Looking at the next slide, which is suppliers and buyers. One of the responses we could work with companies of adequate size, credibility and significant regional players, associations that exist to use a pull strategy with developing the supply chains and value chains. Once more clustering of local strategic industry partners and localised growing, harvesting and storage trials are really important. Developing that North Queensland cluster again, as you can see the cluster is becoming somewhat the focus here of how we move forward. Likewise with buyers, loose cooperatives or cluster approach to market access at an industry level. Once more use R&D again to develop and actuate downstream use of the crop in Queensland, and develop North Queensland cluster supply chain firms from growing to value adding and export at an industry level. Next slide, please. Apologies, Liz, I haven't been saying next slide. So if we look at a summation of regionality, rivalry and competitiveness as a response, why is North Queensland considered to be a place that maybe we should undertake this? Because of its comparative advantage, you can do 2+ crops per annum, making it a productive yield environment. And tropical agronomics withstanding, we could establish the comparative advantage of the tropics as a place to be able to grow hemp and seed. Develop a North Queensland cluster of supply chain firms, and this is really a regional development cluster idea. We can look at utilising a pull strategy and developing the entire supply chain and value chain. And this really involves industry and stakeholder engagement and developing a strategic marketing plan. We can look at a tropical industrial hemp industry and developing their capabilities from a globally competitive position, and using 21st century ag and food tech industry approaches, excuse the typo there. We can work with all three tiers of government to access the 10 to 30,000 hectares of greenfield possibilities NQ and greyfields, and utilise both venture capital support and CRR4, or the concentration ratio of the four highest valued industry partners on the stock exchange, to increase total factor productivity. Next slide. This is a slide I pulled off from ABARE. It's a little bit dated, but essentially says unless you can get that 1 metric tonne per hectare and produce that $1,800 in gross margin per hectare, you're probably not going to get growers to contract grow for you. So I've thrown that slide in there because it's really just a financial consideration that you have to look at when you're benchmarking. If we look at the supply chain, sorry, next slide, sorry Liz, industrial cannabis supply value chain, this is probably a really important representation for us to be aware of. The important thing is that where does venture capital and investment really need to be taken? And from a perspective in industry, if we're looking at dollars and cents, you'll probably see that the VC are important, will be linked to, or investors would like to be in the brokerage area, proprietary genetics, ag and food tech, and the processing, manufacturing, sales and distribution, because it's a pivotal point that connects all the other players in the supply chain. And when you look at that, just down the bottom, I've got dollars from venture capital and industrial cannabis firms, and to the right, we've got dollars from the concentrated ratio for industrial cannabis firms on the ASX, feeding into the cropland, contracted farming, harvest, drying, storage, and technology. So that's kind of our model, and I'm hoping you've managed to capture that as we're going. If we shift to the next slide, which is number 13, I'm going to introduce Wandora as the North Queensland firm, which is kind of like the preferred industry partner to work with. From a Queensland perspective, they are based in Townsville, so have got a presence in the tropical environment. And they, even though they weren't aware of my industry analysis documentation until fairly recently, they went ahead and started doing things as per what I'd written about in my analysis. They were thinking and planning across the entire supply chain. They looked at it as an industry development exercise, but as a company. They started engaging with government and private capital. They realized that hemp products to be acceptable will require volume and capacity, and where's that going to come from? So we need to have large tracts of land where hemp could be grown. And North Queensland has some of that surplus land, as I mentioned in the comparative advantage document above. They're also interested in investing in best practice technology, advanced manufacturing and skills, and this fits into the ag tech and food tech information recommendation as part of the competitive framework. And they also go on to say that it requires a national strategy, which is correct as well. And possibly this is about setting up a series of regional hubs, which falls in line with my cluster recommendations in the previous documentation. So when you look at Wandora, you can see that they've actually engaged with a few groups. There's CSIRO, there's the Queensland government, there's Canadian venture capital funds, there's federal government adult industry, there's regional councils and technical further education, and there's also looking at contacting engineering companies to ensure that some of the important downstream stuff are actually addressed in developing the supply chains. And the final slide there is really just an example of the different stakeholders that Wandora have engaged in, including Department of Ag and Fisheries. So they've actually undertaken this activity more like an industry development activity than a firm development activity. And so they are very much following that guideline of the industry analysis approach and trying to develop this industry in North Queensland. Next, final slide. It's just me standing in front of one of Omid and Sarah's crops many years ago out in the Lockyer Valley.